What's up everyone, Steven here from techmaker.tv. In this episode I'm going to show you how to build out simple CRUD actions in Rails. This is meant to be a beginner friendly video, so if you're just getting started and want to see how to actually build out database interactions and so on and so forth, this video is for you. Before we jump in, I just want to tell you that we're putting out new programming tutorials on our channel every single day, so if you like that kind of stuff, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a comment below letting me know what you'd like to learn. With all of that being said, let's go ahead and just get started. So the first question is, what is CRUD? So CRUD is an acronym for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. And this is in reference to things we can do to data in the database. So we can add data, aka create. We can read data, so we can just look at what's there already. We can update data, so that means we can change data. And we can delete data, which is remove it, obviously. So a lot of this may be kind of self-explanatory, but I just want to kind of spell it out the best that I can. So in this video, we're going to look at two specific things. We're going to look at literally how this process works with what's called active record in Ruby on Rails, which is a way of just interacting with the database in a nutshell. And then we're also going to look at it through the lens of the entire request response cycle when you go to a URL or when you're doing something in your web browser. So let's get started by actually setting up a couple of things that are going to allow us to do this. So a couple of quick things. So I'm in this app that I call Notes app, and there's another video that I will link to down in the description if you want to see the very first episode for this app where we started setting up user accounts and so on. So I won't go through all of that again here. We'll just kind of jump in. If you've got a brand new Rails app, all of this for the most part should still work, with the exception of anything related to users. If you want to do this exactly, you can follow along by going to that video in the description. Also, I just remembered that there was a comment. Somebody asked me to zoom in, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit on both of these things really quick. Let me get this kind of resituated. Maybe. Okay, so hopefully that's a little bit better. Now that's a little bit big over here, but that's fine. So what we're going to do to kick this off, and I'm actually going to move this a bit and move this so that we can see what I'm typing on both sides a little bit better. We're going to generate what's called a scaffold in Rails, and if you're brand new to Rails, this can feel very magical. If you're been working with Rails for not very long, it can also feel a little bit magical, so bear that in mind. But I'll walk you through the course of this episode exactly what this does, or at least a lot of it. So we're going to type Rails G, which is short for generate, and we're going to say scaffold, and I'm going to have a concept called notebook in this app. This is going to be a note-taking app, so it's just going to be called notebook, and I'm going to give it a title. So this is saying that my notebook has a title, and I'm also going to say, well, let's say, I think it's user references is how it should be. Now, if you don't have a user, if you didn't go through that previous episode, leave this little bit off. If you're following along, you can add this. So we'll just hit enter, and this should generate a bunch of stuff for us, hopefully. And then what we can do is say Rails DB migrate. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to create a table in the database called notebooks. And I'll show you why. So if we look in this DB folder over here, and again, we're going to come back to some of this later, so there will be more description, but you can see here that there's this notebook or create notebooks migration, and so you can see what it's doing is creating a table called notebooks and so on. I'll leave reading up on this as an exercise, but anyway, I just want you to kind of see where things are. So if we hit enter, that's going to actually create this table in the database. Okay, so what I want to do, and I'm going to clear this again so we're back at the top. What I'm going to do is enter into what's called the Rails console. So if we say Rails C, basically what it does is it loads up our app, and we can actually start interacting with the database and with the code right here. So what I'm going to do, so first of all, if we just type notebook, right here you can see that it's got an object and it's telling us to call .connection to establish a connection and so on. So if I say notebook dot first, it's going to tell me nil because there's nothing in this table yet. We haven't done anything to put anything in here. So let's look at how we can create data. So first of all, if this is your first exposure to Rails, this is kind of a pretty good place to start. I'll show you kind of how easy it is to add things to the database. So I should have a user actually, and again, like go back to the previous episode if it's down in the description. If you're confused by this, it will totally clear this up. But if I look, so I have another object called user, and if I do user.first, you can see here, this is me. I signed up for the app yesterday through the browser when I built all this out. So what I can do is I can say user equals user.first, and now I can actually interact with this user. Okay, so in actual fact, that is an example of the read part here. So we're able to read from the database, but let's set that aside for a second, but we will need this user based on how I have this set up. So what I want to do is say notebook equals notebook.create, and then what I'm going to do is say title, and then we'll just say like daily notes or something like this. And then because this actually belongs to a user in this case, so if that makes sense, right? Like if I'm creating a notebook, I want my user to actually own it. What I want to do is say user ID is user.id. And so this is our create over here. So it's really simple just to add data to the database. And now if I say notebook.count, there should be one notebook. Okay, so if I do notebook.first, it's actually going to print out, or look up rather, my notebook right here. So that's one way to kind of read data from the database. The way that you're typically going to see, so you can see here that when we add a record to the database, it automatically gets this ID. So like this is the first one into the database, so it has an ID of 1. So now if I do notebook.find and then I pass in that ID 1, it's going to give me back my notebook. So now we've basically covered create and read, right? So, and there's all sorts of ways you can read data from the database. It's just generally called querying. So you could do like notebook.all, and that actually gives me back kind of it's not the same thing. So you can see here, this is our one notebook and it's inside of this kind of collection. So if we had multiple notebooks, we would get them all back right here. So I am going through this kind of quick, so feel free to obviously watch the video multiple times, but leave comments down and ask me any questions you have, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. One thing that you might be concerned about or confused about is, how do we know which data to pass in? So when we actually created this scaffold previously, we told that we had a title and we said that the user ID, or the user was references, whatever that means to you, right? So if we look in our schema, this is kind of always the source of truth you want to go back to. So here you can see we've created this table, notebooks, and it has a string, which is title, and it has an integer, which is the user ID. So that's why we're able to say, the user ID is user.id or whatever. And then there's a couple of automatic things here added so that the database essentially knows what time every record was created, and it keeps track of every time it was updated and so on. But we won't go too deep into that. So let's talk about how to actually update data. So let's say that we want to change the title. So we have our notebook stored in a variable, right? Yeah, so we can say notebook.update, and we can say title, and then say weekly notes. We're getting lazy, so we only want to take notes on a weekly basis. And so now if we type notebook, you can see here that the title has been changed. So that's updating. So all things considered, we've covered create, read, and update, and it's pretty straightforward. So what we can actually do to delete this is just say notebook.destroy. And that's it. So now we've covered all of CRUD. So now if we do notebook.reload, because it's still held in that variable, if we reload, now it's going to say couldn't find notebook with that ID, and that's because it's gone. So if we do notebook.count, there's 0 notebooks. Alright, so I think we've played around with this enough. Let's go over to a browser. Let's go ahead and start our server. So we'll quit out of that, just type quit, and then say Rails S. This will start up a Rails server, and then we'll go look in a browser for a second. So let me open up a new window here. And we'll go to localhost 3000. So this bit right here, first of all, that's strange. Let me do something really quick. So this is a real product that I'm building, and if you want to follow along with the entire process, subscribe to the channel. And then I'm also going to be posting some work sessions on our website, so I'll tell you more about that later, but just bear in mind this is going to be a real product that we're building from scratch, and we're going to record the whole process. Okay, that's going to snap into place better now. So definitely do what you want to do to keep in touch, because you probably don't want to miss it if you're trying to learn this stuff. So we won't worry about any of what's on the screen here because it's totally irrelevant right now. What I want to do is just go to /notebooks, and you'll see here that we have this notebooks, and then we have a new notebook link and so on. So if I click new notebook, I can type a title, so daily musings, and I need to give it a user ID of 1, or really whatever number you want, but I think it might have to exist. The user may have to exist, so there's only that one user right now, so I'm just going to put 1. But if I create notebook, we'll get a little message, notebook was successfully created. I can edit this thing, and I can say weekly whatever, same thing. I can destroy it. All the same stuff we just did over here in the terminal. So if you're not a total beginner, there's some details of this that you look at and they might not make perfect sense. We're going to clear a lot of that up in the next episodes, which are going to be a couple of work sessions. So don't worry about that for now. But otherwise, you might be wondering how in the world all of that worked. So let's go back to our code and let's talk about it just a little bit. So if you think about what we did, the first thing we did is we entered in a URL in the browser. And that URL points somewhere, and that's sort of where the mystery begins if you are brand new to this. So where we went was actually localhost /notebooks. And then what we did is we clicked on new notebook, right? And if you look down here, it's going to disappear, but in the very bottom of the browser, you can see that that's going to notebooks/new. If I click on it, that goes to new up here, and so on and so forth. So, and then if I fill this out and I click create notebook, that goes somewhere else. That's not a typical link, that's something else. So let's analyze exactly how that works. So essentially, the way that this works is there's URLs, and those point at what you would call routes in Rails, and in a lot of other frameworks, frankly. And then the routes point at what's called a controller. And so the routes essentially have a job, and their job is to say, hey, I just noticed somebody kind of went to a URL, and where should that URL point to? And then the controller is ultimately where the route points to. So then the controller then says, okay, you're trying to visit this URL, what should we do about that? Okay. So then ultimately the controller does some stuff, which we'll just leave at that for a second, and then it renders what's called a view. So the view is what shows up in the browser in a nutshell. Now, one thing that the controller does is, among other things, is it interacts with what is called a model. Now, let me see if I can do some kind of funny stuff here with my keyboard. So it'll interact with a model, and it's going to look kind of weird like that, but anyway, so you get the idea. So URL hits the routes. The route says, okay, where are they trying to go? They send them to the right controller, depending on what's in the URL. And then the controller will interact with models, which when we were over here in the terminal talking to this notebook, we were typing notebook. What that actually is a model. A model is a piece of code that knows how to talk to the database. So the controller will talk to that kind of stuff, and then once it figures everything out, it will render a view which will display everything. So if you're totally new to programming, this idea is very common, and it's called model view controller. So earlier when we ran that Rails G scaffold, essentially what Rails figured out is that if you follow some naming conventions, you can generate all of this really quickly just with one little command. So it'll automatically generate routes, it'll automatically generate a controller with some stuff in it, as we'll see in a second. It'll generate the model, and it'll generate the views. So it gives you a ton of stuff for free, which is amazing. So let's start by looking at the routes. Now, to be totally honest, the routes are not going to be the most informative thing the first time you see them. So if you go to config and you go into routes, you're going to see this resources : notebooks. And this, as with many things in Rails, has a lot of magic in it. So the thing you have to know about basic kind of CRUD actions, or really just how things work in a framework like Rails, is you have several different types of HTTP methods. And I won't go super deep into this here. If you really want to learn, you definitely have to follow along with all of the videos, because we're going to be doing a lot of stuff like this. So, but we won't. So in other words, you have to kind of stick around longer to get a lot deeper. But I'm going to try to gloss over it here a little bit. So we have a few different things. So, and you can actually see it over here in the server, but let's talk about it first. So there are several things. You have get requests, you have post requests, you have put, you have patch, and I think patch and put are actually similar, or maybe patch replaces put, I'm not entirely sure. And you have delete, and there may be some others. So these are HTTP method types. So whenever you click on a link, that is a get request. You're saying get me this link. So let's go back to our browser and let's click on some stuff. So if I click on Notes app, you're going to see here started get / over here in the server. If I click, or if I just type in / notebooks and I hit enter, you're going to see started get / notebooks. Same thing if I click on notebook, get / notebooks new. Okay, let's create a new notebook and let's see what happens. So I'm going to create another one, daily musings, and we'll say create notebook. And so that actually did two things, and you have to pay careful attention here to catch that. But you see started post notebooks. So whenever we create new things in the database, that normally goes through a post request in HTTP. And then what actually happened is it redirected after it did the post, so it redirects to another thing, so you have a get request. So submitting that form actually ends up with two requests. If we edit and we call this weekly right here, let's check out the same thing. So it's really good to learn how to read your various tools that you're using and see what's happening. But you can see here started patch. So whenever we're doing an update, we're patching. And finally, let's delete it. Same thing, it redirects at the end, so you have a get. But you can see here you have started delete notebook /3. So all of that being said, if we go back to our code over here, so we definitely don't want to leave that there because that's not real code. Normally what we would do if we wanted to get some path, or if we wanted to define a route so that we would know how to handle something, what we do is say get, and we might say / something, and then we would tell it that we wanted to point at the something controller, and then we would tell it which action on the controller to point at. So that's normally how you would do a get, and then the same thing for post, so on and so forth. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. What we have here for notebooks, because the scaffolds did it for us, is this resources notebooks. So a trick to see what all your routes are is to, and I'm going to have to actually bring this out further to see this, but if we say Rails routes, this will print out all of the available defined routes. Now we have a bunch, so I'm going to do something else which is not Rails specific, but it's Rails routes, and then do a pipe symbol grep notebook, And then we'll see all the routes specifically related to notebooks. So I'm trying to figure out what's the, oh, hold on, sorry. Let me get the right width here so that we can actually see something. Why is that so weird? Let me zoom back out maybe. I cannot get that going on right. Let me run this again, a little bit spaced out. I don't know what's going on with this. See if that format's better like that. Okay, it's still kind of wonky, but we'll live with it. So here you've got notebooks get, and it's telling you that this points at, hold on a second. So I have no idea why they put so much space in here. That feels strange to me. Whatever. So I'll fix my terminal in here in a second, but what I was going to say is, so we have these routes defined where we have a get request defined at /notebooks, and that's pointing at our notebooks controller with an index action. We have a post to notebooks, which is our notebooks create. Same thing, you can read through all of this, but you can see basically all the things we've been doing, get, post, and then some different gets. And then it's pointing at actions in our controller. So it's what I was saying earlier. So the routes basically say, I'm receiving a request at this location, where should I go? And in this case, it's saying, send me to the notebooks edit. The one last trick that's in here is you have this :ID. Now basically what this is a variable. So you saw when we were creating and updating earlier that we get these IDs. So let's say that I went to /notebooks/1. What that's going to do is it's going to say, in that case, the ID is equal to 1. So bear that in mind in a second, because you're never going to see :ID in a URL. And we can actually just look at that really fast. We go to new notebook. I'm not running my server. If we go over here and we go to notebooks new again, so now we can see here that I'm at /notebooks4. So if I go back up here, you can see that this is actually pointing me at get notebooks/ID is 4, and that goes to this notebook show. Okay, so we've kind of hammered that point a little bit. Let's go back and maybe put this back where it was. And let's go back and look at our code. So let's go look at the controller. So now we've looked at how this works. You're going to have to probably study on this a little bit more. I don't expect this to be the end-all episode for how Rails works, but it's a quick flyover that should give you a pretty good idea. So if we look at the notebooks controller, so this is what the scaffold generated for us. So you should recognize all of these, right? So we did this earlier. I mean, we did create instead of new, which I'll let you read up on, but it's all fairly similar to what we were doing before. We have the update right here, so on and so forth. Down here at the bottom, we have this notebook find params ID. So that ID is that number that was in the URL, and the params is how you access it. And if we scroll up to the top, what we can see is that we're calling this set notebook on show, edit, update, and destroy. And if I scroll back over here, oh man, this is kind of wonky. Let me see if I can blow this back out and get it to look right. So we need an ID on show, right? We need an ID on edit. We need an ID on update. And we need an update, or we need an ID on destroy. So if we go back over to our code, you can see that we have show, edit, update, and destroy, where we're doing this before action set notebook. So I'm just trying to show you kind of how all of this fits together. And the last thing, and I won't walk through all of the HTML or anything, but if you look in, let's say that we're on the index, right? So we have at notebooks is notebook.all. So as we saw earlier, this will give us all of the notebooks that exist. If we scroll down here and we look at the views notebooks folder, which was also automatically generated, so the index action will correspond to this index.html. And so you can read through here and kind of see. So what's cool about these scaffolds is it gives you something real you can play with really fast. So you can actually go over in the browser and play around with that. It's actually a little app, that you generate in just a couple of seconds. So you can actually run all of your CRUD operations through the browser, and then you can come through here and look at exactly how that works. So you have the form, or you don't have a form on this page. You have just this loop where you're going through all the notebooks and printing out all the stuff in a table row. If you go to the new, you can see you're rendering a form, and this is the form right here. So I'll let you read up through all of this stuff, but that's essentially how all of that fits together. So this tutorial is starting to get a little bit long, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it here. I essentially wanted this to be a good flyover before we dive into some of our future work sessions and then get a little bit deeper, so that if you're a little bit newer, you won't be totally lost, hopefully. So again, if you have any questions about this, just throw something down in the comments and I'll answer as much as I can. And I definitely look forward to keeping going with this in the next couple of episodes. So if you're interested in that, definitely subscribe to the channel, and I will talk to you next time.